You just said about the Secretary's upcoming travel. Ukraine's future belongs in NATO. Do you expect any progress toward that end at the upcoming meeting? What's the I know the administration has spoken about that before, but what do you see any concrete progress in that at this point?
So every time that we meet as NATO allies, and that includes in the foreign ministers' meetings, includes in the defense ministers' meetings, and of course it includes the summits, which happen once a year. But every one of those last a number of meetings, we have talked about Ukraine's progress towards NATO, and we will continue to talk about that here. We'll have a number of meetings where he talks about how we can continue to pursue interoperability to make sure that Ukraine can work with NATO allies, and to talk about the reforms that that Ukraine continues to make to prepare its path towards NATO. I don't want to preview any actions that we will take at this meeting, but certainly every time we can get together as allies and to talk with our Ukrainian counterparts, it's an important step along that road towards NATO membership.
Sure. Unless somebody wants to continue that, can I change to Syria?
Sure.
I know there are at least one statement over the weekend from the administration on this. I guess to begin with, in simple terms, what does the U.S. want to see happen in Syria right now? We've seen rebels advance on Aleppo. What's the policy outcome that the U.S. sees?
Sure. So in the immediate term, what we want to see are de-escalation and protection of civilians and minority groups. But our overall policy remains the same, is that we want to see a serious and credible political process to end this civil war once and for all, with a political settlement consistent with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. As you know, Sean, that resolution calls for a process facilitated by the United Nations where the Syrian regime and the opposition groups would negotiate a path forward for Syria. It's important that that path be Syrian-led and that have a process that ultimately leads towards elections. That's what we want to see over the long term, but in the short term, we want to see a de-escalation of the situation and protection of civilians.
And what policy levers does the U.S. have? I saw that the Secretary spoke with Foreign Minister Fidan yesterday. Turkey arguably has more influence than any others on these rebels. Was there a message to Turkey or to the rebels via Turkey?
So I'm not going to talk about the private diplomatic conversation that he had with Foreign Minister Fidan, but in all of our conversations with countries in the region, we continue to urge every country to use any influence it has to press for de-escalation. We don't want to see any country try and take advantage of the situation in Syria, to try to take advantage of the instability in Syria. We want to see all countries use their influence, use their leverage to push for de-escalation, protection of civilians, and ultimately a political process forward.
And for Assad, there's over the years there have been various statements on Assad's future. What's the U.S. policy? Should Assad stay? Is the U.S. basically tacitly accepting that he's the least worst option?
So look, nothing has changed with respect to our policy. Assad is a brutal dictator with blood on his hands, the blood of innocent civilians inside Syria, blood of his own people on his hands. Ultimately, what we want to see is a political process forward where the Syrian people get to determine who their leaders are. As I said, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 called for such a process. The Syrian government has never participated in that process. We continue to call on them to do so. We continue to call on all countries to use their influence to push forward that kind of political process that would lead to a path forward for the Syrian people, where the regime engages with opposition groups. We also believe it would be helpful if Russia and Iran stopped their destabilizing influence inside Syria. We have seen them continue to destabilize the situation going back more than a decade now, continue to play a role that is unhelpful not just to the Syrian people, but to the broader region.
Maybe just one more, and then I'll pass on. But with on Iran in particular, obviously the Islamic Republic, this is its biggest ally, state ally in the region. Does the U.S. want to have any sort of break? Does it see that as possible, a break between Assad and the Islamic Republic? And has there been any dialogue or any offers to try to further that goal?
So certainly we want to see Iran stop the destabilizing influence that it has inside Syria, because we're not talking about diplomatic relations between Syria and Iran when we talk about the nature of that relationship. We're talking about Iran continuing to fund and to arm and to back attacks on the Syrian people, something that they have done for some time, in the same way that Russia has done. So we want to see Iran's destabilizing influence in Syria and in the broader region curtailed. We don't object to diplomatic relations between countries. What we do object to is the destabilizing influence that Iran plays in Syria and across the broader region.